In the winter of 1941, when the snow was deep and the German army was sweeping across the Soviet Union, an 18-year-old girl stepped into the darkness of enemy territory. Her boots were made for snow. Her heart was made for fire. This is the story of Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya, a schoolgirl turned partisan who chose death over surrender. But how did a girl like Zoya find herself at the gallows of a German-occupied village, refusing to speak a single word under torture? Stay with us, because by the end of this video you'll understand not just who she was, but why her last act still echoes decades later. If you're drawn to stories of extraordinary courage, hit subscribe now. You won't want to miss what comes next. Let's begin. Before we meet Zoya, let's go back to the world she left behind. In June 1941, Operation Barbarossa shattered the Soviet front lines. Thousands of towns and villages fell within hours. Among the uprooted and terrified were young men, women, school kids. Moscow itself braced for the onslaught. And in that chaos, Zoya Anatolyevna Kosmodemyanskaya was finishing school. She was 17, almost 18, a member of the Komsomol like many of her peers. But unlike most, she volunteered for a mission that changed everything. How did a schoolgirl become a symbol? Let's find out. Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya wasn't born a symbol. She wasn't raised to become a legend, or a name whispered across a continent at war. She was a girl from a quiet Moscow neighborhood, a student who loved literature, who kept a notebook full of poems, who argued passionately about right and wrong long before the world forced her to choose between them. She grew up during a time when fear was everywhere. Yet people who knew her remembered something very specific. Zoya did not bend. Not to pressure, not to authority, not to anything she believed was unjust. When the German invasion began in 1941, most teenagers her age were evacuating, hiding, or simply trying to survive. Zoya did the opposite. She volunteered. She joined a special sabotage unit, a group of young operatives sent behind enemy lines to destroy communication routes, cut supply chains, and show the invaders that no territory would ever truly belong to them. She wasn't the strongest, she wasn't the fastest, but she was the one who always stepped forward first. Her instructors noticed immediately. Zoya had a kind of quiet determination that didn't need shouting, a conviction that made others follow. And though she was just 18, she carried herself like someone who had already made peace with the dangers ahead. This was the person behind the myth, a young woman driven not by hatred, but by a fierce sense of responsibility, and a belief that freedom must be protected by those who are willing to act when others hesitate. Before she ever held a match, before her name echoed far beyond Moscow, she was simply a girl who refused to look away. By November 1941, the front near Moscow was collapsing. Entire villages had fallen under German control, and every road, barn, and wooden shed the invaders used became a piece of the machinery pushing toward the Soviet capital. This was where Zoya's mission began. Her sabotage unit received a task that sounded simple on paper, yet was deadly in reality. Move behind enemy lines, infiltrate occupied villages, and burn down structures the German army was using for shelter and supplies. Every fire meant fewer warm barracks, fewer trucks repaired, fewer soldiers rested enough to fight again. Winter was their ally and also their enemy. Temperatures dropped below 20 degrees. Snow swallowed tracks but also slowed every step. Nighttime brought cover, but also danger, because patrols knew exactly what sabotage units came to do. Zoya and her small group traveled through forests so dark that even snow seemed to vanish. They carried only matches, small bottles of flammable mixture, and the single instruction their commander repeated: "Do not be captured. The mission must continue no matter what. The group successfully lit several fires, watching barns and supply buildings burn like torches in the frozen night. But on the second night, everything changed. A sudden blizzard forced the unit to split. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. German scouts moved closer than expected, and Zoya, searching for the next target, found herself cut off, separated from her group in a territory crawling with enemy patrols. She still had her orders. She still had her mission. And despite the danger, despite knowing she was alone, she chose to press on. That single decision would change everything that happened next. It was the moment when her fate became intertwined with the legend people would later tell. The moment she stepped into history, knowing there might be no return. For hours, Zoya moved through the frozen village outskirts, searching for the next supply barn to destroy. Her footprints vanished behind her as wind swept the snow into drifting white walls. But while the storm hid her tracks, it also hid the people tracking her. Unbeknownst to Zoya, German patrols, alerted by smoke from previous fires, had begun sweeping the area. Their dogs barked through the storm. Boots crunched in the snow. Voices echoed in a language she knew meant danger. Still, she pressed on. When she approached a building used by German troops for shelter, she tried to ignite it, but the mixture failed to burn in the storm. She attempted again, this time drawing attention. Shadows moved. A lantern beam cut through the snow. Someone had seen her. Realizing she was exposed, Zoya tried to escape toward the tree line, but a group of soldiers intercepted her path. With the wind screaming around her, she was forced to stop, surrounded, outnumbered, unarmed. The villagers later recalled the moment. They saw a young woman dragged through the snow, her hair frozen against her face, her coat covered in frost. The soldiers demanded her name, her unit, her commander's identity, the location of the others. She said nothing. Interrogations continued through the night in a small, frigid outbuilding. Officers promised safety if she cooperated. They threatened her when she didn't. But witnesses described her calm, a quiet defiance that seemed to irritate the soldiers more than any shouted resistance. At one point, she reportedly said, "I am not afraid of you." A simple sentence, but enough to silence even armed men. Hours passed, and Zoya remained unbroken. No names, no information, no betrayal. Her captors realized something unusual. This was not a frightened girl caught in the wrong place. This was someone who had chosen her path and was prepared to accept its consequences. And so, as dawn approached, they made their decision. Zoya would not be interrogated again. She would be made an example. Her capture was complete. But her story, the one the world would remember, was only beginning. At dawn, the village gathered in silence. German soldiers marched a single prisoner through the snow, a young woman whose hands were tied, whose steps were slow but steady, whose expression was nothing like what her captors expected. Zoya did not beg, she did not plead. She walked with the calmness of someone who had already accepted the cost of her choices. Villagers who witnessed the scene later remembered the moment the soldiers led her to the makeshift gallows. The wind howled across the square. Frost glittered on her coat. And yet, she stood upright, as if refusing to give the enemy even the dignity of fear. The officers read out a sentence meant to intimidate the villagers, to crush any thought of resistance. But instead, something very different happened. Zoya spoke, not in a whisper, not in trembling fear, in a clear voice carried by the frozen air. Witnesses remembered her words differently, but all versions agree on one thing. She used her final moments not to save herself, but to remind others that the invaders would not win forever. She spoke of the thousands still fighting. She warned her enemies that they would pay for every village they burned, every life they ended. She told the onlookers not to give in, not to bow their heads, not to forget who they were. And as the soldiers prepared to carry out the execution, she said something that stunned even them. A few final lines filled not with fear, but with defiance. Not desperation, but conviction. Her voice, carried on the frozen wind of that winter morning, became a message powerful enough to survive the war itself. Moments later, her body hung silently against the white sky. But the silence that followed wasn't the silence the Germans wanted. It was the silence of shock, of realization, the silence that marks the birth of a legend. Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya was just 18. She had no rank, no armor, no chance of escape. But in her final moments, she displayed something far more dangerous than any weapon: the ability to inspire. And from that point on, she did. When news of a young partisan's execution reached Soviet lines, it spread with a force no one expected. At first, it was only a rumor, a story whispered between soldiers, carried from one dugout to another. A girl, 18, refused to talk, defied her captors to her last breath. But soon, the story found its way to Moscow. Journalists interviewed villagers who had witnessed her final moments. Their accounts were raw, emotional, inconsistent in details, but identical in meaning. This girl had died with more courage than most people ever show in their lives. The effect was immediate. Newspapers printed her story on their front pages. Posters appeared in schools, factories, and army units. Her name became a rallying cry, not because she sought fame, but because people needed proof that resistance was still possible, even in the darkest months of the war. Within weeks, volunteers flooded partisan groups. Commanders reported something extraordinary. Entire units formed simply because people said they wanted to fight like Zoya. And as the Red Army pushed back against the German advance near Moscow, soldiers carried her story with them, a reminder of what was at stake and of the price already paid. After the war, her legacy only grew. Streets, schools, and towns were named after her. Memorials were built across the country. Historians debated the details of her final hours, but one thing remained beyond dispute. Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya had become a symbol of defiance, of sacrifice, of the belief that even one voice, even one life, can shift the spirit of an entire nation. But her true legacy isn't the monuments or the titles. It's the impact she had on people who never knew her, those who found strength in her story, inspiration in her courage, and hope in the fact that someone so young could stand so tall in the face of death. Her captors ended her life that winter morning, but they could not end what she represented. Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya's story isn't just a page in a history book. It's a reminder of something simple and uncomfortable, that real courage often comes from the people we least expect. She wasn't a commander. She wasn't a seasoned fighter. She was a teenager with a sense of responsibility far larger than her years. Someone who believed that freedom is protected not only by armies, but by individuals who choose to act when others remain silent. When you look at her life, not the legend, but the girl herself, you see a person who understood the risks, felt the fear, yet moved forward anyway. A person whose choices were carved not from pride, but from conviction. And maybe that's why her story survived long after the war ended. Because courage like hers is timeless. It speaks to anyone who has ever faced something bigger than themselves. Anyone who wondered whether one voice matters. Anyone who ever felt small in the face of something immense. Zoya's answer was simple. Yes, one voice matters. One act matters. One person can change the way others see the world, even if their own world ends far too soon. If her story resonated with you, if you believe tales of quiet bravery deserve to be remembered, then this channel is where they live. There are so many more voices history nearly lost, so many stories waiting to be told. So if you want to hear them, the forgotten, the untold, the unbelievable, hit subscribe, stay with us, and we'll uncover them together. This was the story of Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya, a girl who refused to surrender, a girl who chose conviction over fear, a girl who showed the world that even in the coldest winter, one spark can light a fire.